The night water off Bougainville lay flat and black, a sheet of ink pressed by tropical heat and the weight of a new moon. Coconut trees along the low fringe of Empress Augusta Bay swayed without sound, their shadows lost in the wider shadow of the island. Over that darkness came the PBY Catalina, paint so matte and black that the seaplane seemed to be a moving absence, an outline of night with engines. The crew wore blackened faces, the cockpit smudged with charcoal to kill any hint of reflection. The Pratt and Whitney engines held a steady droning note, twin circles of power that rose from Halavo Bay at dusk and now idled across the slot at a height no higher than the palms. The patrol plane moved like a patient hunter, slow, sure, a black cat on the prowl. The U.S. Navy had painted the PBY Catalina's black for this work, and the name stuck the way salt sticks to canvas. Black cats. It was a name whispered at Bougainville by tired Marines on the beach who could not see the planes but could see the light the planes brought. It was spoken with anger and fear by Japanese convoy guards who could not hear the approach until the bomb fuses began to spin in the slipstream. The PBY squadrons learned the night as a map. They read the wind as if it were inked on a chart. They counted seconds from flare to splash, from splash to shockwave. The men of patrol squadrons VP-12 and VP-33 and their sister units had become creatures of darkness, and the darkness belonged to them. On Bougainville that month, the 3rd Marine Division held a raw beachhead at Cape Torquena. November of 1943, the month when the U.S. Marines landed under a curtain of smoke and the cruisers of Task Force 39 fought the night action at Empress Augusta Bay. The Marines dug in along coconut groves and kanai grass and swamp edge while bulldozers carved out hard ground for a fighter strip. The men listened for the night approaches of the Tokyo Express and the whistle of shells from the direction of Buka Passage. The 3rd Marine Division was young in the line, but it had steel in it. It needed supply, it needed quiet nights for runway graders, and it needed the enemy convoys to stop slipping down the slot with ammunition and troops. The Black Cats understood what the Marines needed. They would make the slot a place that burned. In the early hours, the Catalina turned north along the western approaches to St. George Channel, a place where Japanese convoys funneled out of her bow like beads from a broken string. The pilot kept the big boat on the deck, wings only a few hundred feet above the black water. The flight engineer watched the cylinder head temperatures, scanning the dials by the faintest light. The ASV radar set ticked in the waist, its low breathing across the sea, and the radar operator kept his headphones pressed tight. The scope showed the green smear of Bougainville's coast, the long arc of the bay, and a moving tooth of light at 40 miles that had not been there the minute before. The operator marked it with a chin and a grease pencil. Contact, bearing 320, range 39. There was no need for a voice raised in a shout. The Black Cats did not shout. They tightened. The pilot rolled his wrist against the yoke, and the PBY slid into a bank so gentle a man's coffee would not stir. The co-pilot did the numbers in a whisper. Time to intercept, altitude to hold, airspeed to keep. The navigator plotted lines on a lapboard that looked like a sea-soaked altar. They had flown this pattern many nights. The Catalina's crew knew the smell of Japanese diesels burning at low throttle. They knew the look of a convoy under blackout, the way a ship's wake glows with natural light when plankton are churned at speed. They knew the air above a convoy is not empty, that it is thick with heat and oil and the vibration of men who believe they are unseen. The Japanese convoy pushed south in 2 columns, a screen of destroyers ahead and on the flanks, and a string of Maris riding low with cargo and troops. The destroyers were veterans of the slot, sailors who had run iron back and forth through Iron Bottom Sound since the campaign for Guadalcanal. They carried long lance torpedoes that had terrorized every U.S. destroyer captain in the Solomons a year before. They had searchlights caged and ready, and guns trained to the edges where black meets black. Yet the destroyer skippers had learned a new feeling that autumn, a cold draft through the open bridge of the best night navy in the world. Radar-guided American cruisers had humiliated them at Empress Augusta Bay. Radar-directed gunfire had found ships beyond the reach of a lookout's eye. The Black Cats were something else again. They were a low growl at sea level, a thunder that came with light like day, and bombs that walked along a deck. The Catalina shadowed the Convoy. The radar operator kept his mark faint on the set, never flooding the tube with gain, never losing the weak teeth of distant steel. The crew flew parallel at 10 miles, then at 8, then at 6. The pilot kept his hands easy on the yoke as if to steady a skittish horse. The waist hatch opened. The night air came in hot and smelled like salt and smoke and magnesium. A flaresman clipped the safety wire from the first canister, a parachute flare set to burn like a small sun. The bombardier checked his panel and ran a finger across the arming levers for the 100-pound parafrag clusters and the 500-pound general-purpose bombs hung under the wings. The ordnance was clean, fuses set right, arming wire secured. When the flare fell, the world would shift. On the Japanese flagship, a compact destroyer on the lead beam, a navigation officer traced courses that ducked into squalls. The captain muttered a string of bearings to his helmsman. The radio compartment kept its code books ready in case a contact report needed to go out to Rabal's air. The captain had run this road so many times that his body felt the slot as a lesson learned in the bone. His men were tired but proud. The Imperial Japanese Navy had owned the night since the Sino-Japanese War. It had trained harder and fought harder in darkness than any other navy on Earth. Tonight would be another routine run to Bougainville, another proof that American Marines would never be fully resupplied, another demonstration that the Tokyo Express still ran. The captain did not know that a black-painted seaplane was matching his ship at speed, across the horizon, only a few minutes from an active man-made sunrise. The Black Cat eased ahead of the convoy and then cut in, silent and low, riding the dark. The pilot gave a hand signal and the flaresman tripped the release. The first parachute flare fell with a hiss, a white-hot bead that pulled a silk flower out of the night. At 200 meters above the sea it blossomed and hung. Light washed over the lead destroyer, crashed across the bows of the next, and turned the faces of sailors into masks. The sea became a field of gray glass. Shadows leaped and crouched on decks as men threw up hands to cover eyes ruined by blackout. The air split with shouts, then gun orders, then the clatter of fast elevating mounts. It was always this way. The first light stunned and blinded. The bombs and parafrags followed the light like a whip. The bombardier called steady. The pilot kept as straight a line as a runway. The Black Cat walked the first parafrag stick across the forecastle of the lead destroyer. 100-pound canisters opened in a wave and a rain of small bombs fell, each armed with a wraparound fuse that spun in the slipstream and exploded inches after contact. The front guns of the destroyer vanished in sparks and smoke. Sailors disappeared into white clouds that tore metal and flesh without mercy. The plane crossed the second destroyer at masthead height. The gunners opened up too late. The Catalina's guns chattered in reply, the waist guns throwing tracer into the bridge. The second flare popped alive, and its light reached down the column to where the first transport tried to shear out of line. The PBY lined up a low run at that transport, a fat Maru heavy with crates and men. The pilot dropped the nose slightly, held the speed, let the wings speak in a deep vibration that said the edge was close. The bombardier toggled two 500-pounders for a skip. The bombs hit the water short of the bow, ricocheted along the gray surface like stones, and slammed into the lower plates under the well deck. The flash was red and sharp. Pressure rolled out under the Catalina and pushed the wing up in a wobble. A sheet of smoke and steam ripped open. Men fell from the ship into a boil of light and dead fish and splintered wood as crate lashings snapped and cargo broke loose. The convoy tried to answer the flare with fire. One searchlight found the Catalina for a heartbeat and then died under the hammer of the plane's starboard gun. Tracers came up in a gassy curve. Black water erupted with blind splashes as the crews shot at ghosts on a moonless sky. The destroyers began to zig and search. They needed to form for a torpedo attack against the source, but there was no clear source. The Black Cat did not stick around for the same run. It slid out into the dark and arced back to come in from a new quarter. Another Black Catalina took station 10 miles south and lit a flare that fell like a comet and birthed another sun. The convoy found itself trapped between two lights and two shadows. The Japanese officers tried to pick which light to fear more. On the beachhead at Cape Torquena, a signalman of the 3rd Marine Division stepped out of a sandbagged command post and stared at the northern sky. He saw the twin suns reach down and pulse against the horizon and knew the Black Cats were at work. The Marines had learned to sleep through most of the war, but they would rise to watch a show like this. A corporal whispered to a friend that he owed a drink to every pilot of VP-12. A sergeant of engineers counted seconds between flares and blasts because he had learned a superstition that numbers keep men alive. Bulldozers idled near the forward line. Naval gunfire support officers looked north and made notes about those flares and the timing of star shell fires from the cruisers when next the destroyers came close to the bay. Every man on the line felt the night turn in their favor. The enemy would have less ammunition in the morning. There would be fewer shells from the direction of Buka Passage. The runway would grow another 50 yards at dawn. The Black Cats knew they were not alone in the dark. Far offshore, the cruisers of Task Force 39 and their radar screens kept watch for any counter-thrust. Destroyers with SG radar, not pickets yet by name but pickets by function, spread in a woven screen against a night surface attack. The land-based fighters on Barracoma watched weather and readied a dawn sweep. PT boats crouched by the mangroves in coves that faced the slot, waiting for a radio call that might guide them into paths left bright by the Black Cat's flares. The night in the Solomons was a team sport by then, and every player knew his path. The Catalina crossed the convoy again, this time stepping its parafrag clusters along the sterns of two transports that had chosen to run together as if closeness could defeat light. Each little bomb made a hammer tap sized for a man, but 100 taps break steel that was not meant to ring. Deck guns burst like fruit. Hatches flew open and then slammed into air. The smell of the blast rode up through the open waste hatch and filled the plane with the hot iron taste of a foundry. The pilot pulled a shallow climb and held it to clear a rigging forest. Behind and below, a gun captain on the aftermount of a destroyer fought to find the slow-moving shadow against the blown-out background of flare and flame. He squeezed the trigger into a guess. The Catalina took a fist of holes along the trailing edge and a slug into the wing tank. Fuel leaked like tears and then slowed as the self-sealing lining did its work. The Black Cat stayed a Black Cat. The Japanese convoy commander broke radio silence. He had kept his calm through many runs under air attack. This was different, this was everywhere at once. He began to turn his ships toward a squall line to the west. He ordered smoke and extra lookouts on the wings. He ordered speed made good even at the cost of wakes like silver arrows. He bunched his ships and called for air cover from Rabaul. He had survived radar-guided shellfire from American cruisers at Empress Augusta Bay and had sworn never to be trapped again in a crossfire he could not see. Now a crossfire of light pinned him on black water and made his ships into targets that even a rookie bombardier could not miss. A second PBY from VP-33 slid in from the south and picked up a straggler. A little collier had slipped out of line, perhaps from engine trouble, perhaps from damage taken earlier in the night. The crew of the Catalina marked the ship in the site of their low-altitude bomb site, a simple bead and wire that did not care about ceremony. They came in at 200 feet, the pilot steady, the bombardier ready to walk a tight stick along the length of the ship. 2 bombs skipped and 1 stuck deep and went off with a muffled punch. The ship listed to port and began to settle. Men in dark work clothes shouted against the wind with voices that no one would ever hear. The Black Cat did what it had been built to do. It splayed a flare above the ship to mark the place for the next hunter and climbed into a shallow bank that took it back toward the main body. The convoy's destroyers gathered their wits and began to fire in patterns. A light briefly pointed at the edge of a flare field and it found nothing. The destroyers sprayed the void with machine gun belts. A gun director found a slow echo on the sea and felt sure he had the seaplane that had been slashing their formation. But his plot was a ghost. He had caught his own wake in the flare. Ammunition burned without effect. The convoy's discipline slowly reasserted itself. The formation staggered and then stiffened and began to run. The destroyers loosed a few long lance torpedoes into where they believed a destroyer screen might be, not yet understanding that tonight the enemy's most dangerous weapon did not ride a hull but rode the air at a speed so humble it was overlooked until it was overhead. In the morning, the 3rd Marine Division would count the blessings the night had brought. The beachhead held. No new heavy guns had appeared east of the perimeter. The coastal shelling that sometimes came at dawn was light and ragged and then stopped. The runway at Torquena lengthened by the hour. Seabees worked their machines with the calm of men who have learned that skill beats fear, and that the best thanks is a longer strip and fewer funerals. The Marines drank coffee that tasted like diesel and victory. They would not know fully what had happened at sea. They only knew that the night had run with light, and that the light had belonged to them. The Japanese commanders at Rabaul read the reports from the convoy with faces that did not move. The notes spoke of flares and bombs and moving shadows and the loss of 2 Maris and damage to a 3rd. They spoke of crews blinded by magnesium light and of machine gun fire from a slow plane that hit the bridge of a destroyer. They spoke of a convoy that had arrived late and light. The reports suggested that convoy routes be shifted, that squalls be hugged even tighter, that anti-submarine zigzags be adapted to anti-air zigzags at night. The staff officers did not have a good answer for slow planes that turned night into day. They did not see how much worse it would become once the Black Cats began to guide PT boats into flare-lit lanes where torpedoes could do their old work in a new theater. The Catalina of VP-12 returned to Halavo Bay well after midnight with the first light of false dawn just visible behind a bank of cloud. The seaplane kissed the water in a long flare and skated to a stop on a harbor that gleamed like wet slate. The crew taxied to a buoy and shut down. The engines wound down from drone to sigh. The men climbed out with the heavy walk of those who have held their bodies in one shape for many hours. Ground men splashed forward in skiffs. Ordnance men counted what was left and what would be needed. The pilot filled out a form on a clipboard that already smelled like coffee. The radar operator sent a message to a destroyer division commander that a barge group might be found at dawn pinned under a flare northeast of Buka Passage. This was how the night stitched itself to the day in the Pacific.
Patrol planes hunted.
Marines built. Destroyers moved in like knives. The Marine signalman on the beachhead wrote a letter he would never finish. He tried to describe the night he had just seen. A night where suns rose and fell and ships seemed to ignite like paper lanterns in a storm. He wrote about the noise, about the way magnesium light bites into the eye even at a distance, about the steady sound of bombs like a blacksmith at a forge. He wrote the name Black Cat and paused, and then wrote U.S. Navy PBY Catalina so that anyone who read it would know what to search for if they wanted proof that such planes existed. He underlined Bougainville and Cape Torquena. He underlined 3rd Marine Division. He did not need to underline the word night. In that month, the word night needed no help. The Black Cats returned the following evening to the same water and found no convoy on the first pass. The radar scope was clean. The sea was even and black and hard. The crew flew a ladder pattern for an hour across the approaches that had paid so well the night before. Patience was a weapon too. The radar operator set a range that bit deeper into the dark and saw a smear that trembled like a heartbeat. The pilot went nose down and made a shallow cut of 20 degrees. The crew tightened and felt the old ritual return. The flaresman checked his canister and the bombardier checked his toggles. The navigator made a cross on the board and wrote the time. The plane rolled steady above an enemy that did not know it was already caught. This convoy tried something new. It ran closer to the shoreline of Bougainville, using the low cliffs and tree shadows like a cloak. The destroyers hugged the land and showed their sterns to the sea. The transports followed on the inside like chicks behind a hen. The Catalina adjusted without thinking. The PBY knew the shore as well as the open sea. It eased in over the coastal reef where white water hissed like snakes and the smell of land rose like steam. The crew could have thrown a stone and hit a palm. The pilot felt the lift of heat off the land and rolled a degree to keep the wing clear of a shape that might have been a tree or a cloud. The flares dropped on time and the bombs staggered the lead transport in a field of light that made the palms loom like masts. The Japanese destroyers reacted fast. A pair split from the column and began to drive the seaplane off with disciplined flak patterns. The Black Cat took a line to seaward and then broke hard right into the blind arc of one destroyer's forward mount. The crew's waist gun chattered and drew a spark from the destroyer's bridge wing. The Catalina skimmed the foam line, then lifted just enough to clear a stack of sea and sailed back into the dark like a ghost that had decided to live another day. In that moment A.U.S. Navy PT boat division raced into the lit lane from the south. The little boats carried torpedoes and a sense of purpose. They had whispered with the PBY on a tight radio circuit, words kept to a minimum, bearings traded like a football, and now they were at the edge of the light with teeth set. The PT boats loosed fish into the convoy's wake, and the night held its breath. The first burst of orange broke the surface far down the line. The Black Cat had become a guide star for hunters on water. At dawn, the Marines at Torquena watched a smoke column far offshore that tilted and then fell. The airstrip grew another 100 yards in the heat. The 3rd Marine Division moved its lines a little forward and tightened its wire. The trucks rolled where there had been only mud the week before. The sound of hammers and graters drowned the last whispers of shellfire. In the command log, a few words were entered to mark the night. Black Cat activity heavy. Convoy disrupted. Enemy shelling light. That was all. The truth was larger, but war reduces truth to the lines a man has time to write. By the end of the month, the Imperial Japanese Navy had changed its route lines again and paid another price. The Black Cats learned the new paths by the simple method of flying and flying until the radar set told a story. The crews grew thinner from long nights and short days and the grease that seems to get into a man's food and hair and soul when he works around engines and salt water. They grew harder too. They did not speak in boasts because night flyers tend not to boast. They spoke in bearings and run times and the way a ship looks when parafrags are walking down its deck. They spoke in the names of men they had lost, a waist gunner who had taken a splinter to the throat, a pilot who had not cleared a wave, a plane that had not reported after a final light over St. George Channel. They spoke of the 3rd Marine Division with respect. They spoke of Task Force 39 with a kind of pride. They spoke of Bougainville as if it were a man who had to be carried. In Rabaul, the staff read their maps and knew the truth that would not fit into their telegrams. The enemy had taken the night and turned it against them. The PBY Black Cats were not fast and not new, but they were everywhere and they were patient and they brought suns that moved. The convoys would continue. Rations and ammunition would still run, but the cost would rise. The rate of arrivals would fall. Men would reach Bougainville with less faith in the night than their fathers had taught them to keep. That loss would show on the beach as a smaller stack of crates for a gun crew, as a few fewer mortar rounds at dawn, as a nurse who waited 3 hours for a bandage run that used to take one. War is fought in those inches and those hours. Black Cat stole both. On a different night, a Catalina came home late with a hole in her wing large enough to fit a tire. The crew had wrapped tape and prayer around the damage and flown level over water that wanted them. They taxied in on Halavo's flat slate, and men in skiffs shouted with the relief of the living. The ground crews counted patched fabric and took the measure of courage in fingertips pressed white on a yoke. The ordnance men chalked the names of sunken ships on a board near the ready tent and did not cross out any names from the crew list that afternoon. Someone brewed coffee that tasted worse than usual. Someone slept under a wing with a toolbox for a pillow. They would all go back up at dusk. The Marines at Torquemada kept building. The runway reached its first usable length and then its second. Fighters came in to park on steel mat that sang when boots crossed it. The Black Cats were still out at night, but now the day sky had teeth too. The chain tightened around Bougainville. The water routes grew more expensive for the enemy. Truck Lagoon would feel the hammer in the months to come. Rabaul would be bypassed and strangled. The chain began in nights like these, where a black plane found a black convoy and made a sun. Every war story has a moment where a thing becomes inevitable. At Bougainville that winter, the inevitable came on slow wings under black paint. It was the moment Japanese convoy officers began to flinch when a match was struck on a deck. It was the moment a Marine corporal could sleep an hour longer before dawn because the shelling had come light. It was the moment a destroyer captain reached for his signal lamp to form a plan and found that he mistrusted every light and every shadow. The Black Cats had taught the night to speak American. The crew of the Catalina that had opened the first night of this story stood under their wing at noon and ran through the plan for the coming dusk. They would fly the western approaches again. They would work the range rings again. They would split the convoy's attention and feed bearing lines to the PTs if the sea stayed smooth. They would hold their speed at a place between safety and patience. They would keep their altitude where flak rose late. They would trust the navigator's chin, the radar man's hand, the flaresman's timing, the bombardier's eye, the pilot's hum through the yoke. They would take off without fanfare and without witness, because the men who make night work rarely get parades. They would give the 3rd Marine Division another quiet dawn. The night came. The Catalina lifted. The slot opened like a hallway lined with black mirrors. The crew slid into the routine that kept them alive. The engines settled into their steady droning note. The radar ticked. The nose went down when it had to go down. The flares went out when they had to be thrown. The bombs walked when they had to walk. The Black Cat did its work with the calm of a craftsman and the cold focus of a surgeon. Somewhere behind the horizon, a Japanese convoy commander lifted binoculars to a sky that would suddenly bite his eyes. He did not know the names of the men in the black plane. He would never see their faces. He only knew that he had lost the night. There is a silence that follows blast and light. It is short and thin. It feels like the gap between a heartbeat and the next. The night over Bougainville lived in that gap for months. Each flare, each skip bombing run, each parafrag pattern, each careful bearing whispered to a PT boat, each line drawn in a ready room at Halavo Bay, each cup of coffee that turned black hands browner still. These were the quiet deeds that made the beachhead hold and the runway grow and the enemy convoys arrive late and light. In the morning, the men of the 3rd Marine Division would look out at a sea that pretended to be calm. They would know better. Peace on that water was a gift from the night. The Catalina taxied home again in the hour when the horizon tries to remember the meaning of color. The crew counted what was left. The ground men counted what they would load. The ordnance chief ticked boxes for parafrags and fuses. The pilot filled out another sheet, a record and a ritual. The radar man wrote bearings that only he could have believed were real the first time he ever saw a scope move. The navigator sharpened a pencil and made a new mark on a board that had very little empty space left. The men slept under the wing. The sea lapped at the floats. The sun climbed and burned and then eased. Evening moved in on its cat feet. The black cats went hunting again. Thus the Japanese convoy learned to fear the night along the shores of Bougainville. Thus the 3rd Marine Division slept a little safer, and bulldozers carved a fighter strip into coconut soil that had seen too many men die. Thus the U.S. Navy PBY Black Cats wrote a quiet chapter in a loud war. There were bigger battles and louder victories in places where the names of ships and men are carved in stone under flags. But there are few achievements more precise than stealing an enemy's confidence one flare at a time. The night is a country in war. During the campaign for Bougainville in 1943, the Black Cats held the passport. They moved where they wished. They made light move with them. They hunted, and the hunted learned what that meant.